ventricle connects to the central canal of the spinal cord. So they have the middle aperture and the lateral apertures connect into the meninges, the fluid that's inside the meninges. Okay, so when we look at the cerebrum, this is the largest part of the brain. In us, and so it's about 83% of mass of the brain. And the cerebrum is composed of the cerebral cortex. So when we say cortex, like when we're talking about the renal cortex or the adrenal cortex, that always means the outside. So that's kind of like, if you think about an orange, that's the outside peel of the organ, right? So the cerebral cortex is very thin. So it can be like 4 millimeters in some areas. So it's not a big, thick structure. And it is composed of gray matter. So does the gray matter contain the nerve cell bodies or the axons? The bodies, right? So this contains the nerve cell bodies. So one of the interesting things about our brain is that the neurons migrate to the outside, and that's where the cell bodies reside, and then the axons extend down through the white matter of the brain. That is different when you looked at in lab, when you looked at your spinal cord, because in the spinal cord, the gray matter is in the center and the white matter is on the outside. Okay, so here we have the gray matter on the outside. And this has a large surface area. And that's because of the ridges and grooves. The cerebral cortex has a very large surface area because of the ridges and the grooves, the gyri and the sulci. So then we have the white matter. Right. So this consists primarily of myelinated axons. And we have a particular group of myelinated axons that connects the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. And so does anybody know what structure connects the right and the left cerebral hemispheres?
I can't remember.
Okay. It is called the corpus callosum. And oops, callosum, I think that's how you spell it. And then this is consists of what are called commissural fibers. So remember that I said that one myelinated axon is called a fiber. And commissural means that it transmits, right? It connects to. And so sometimes those, you see them written and they'll point to the corpus callosum and they'll say that's the commissural fibers that are connecting the left and the right hemispheres. Okay. So if we look at the hemispheres, right, they have what is referred to as lateralization. Right? So what that means in a normal person is that the left hemisphere does one thing, tends to be more dominant in one thing, and the right hemisphere tends to be more dominant in the other. So which hemisphere is generally considered to be the creative side of your brain? Right, right? And I always remember that it's the right, because if there's a famous book, if you're an artist, right, that's called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And it's all about, like, when you're drawing a face, if you try to like logic your way through drawing a face, you're not going to get anywhere. right? So like if I'm going to draw something, I actually have to turn off what I think a face looks like and turn off the logic side of my brain. And all I do is I look at shapes, right? So when you're going to draw something, all you start to do is you look at positive space and negative space, and you just look at the shapes, and then all of a sudden you can draw, right? So it's called drawing on the right side of the brain. And so the right side of the brain tends to be more creative, and it also tends to be more visual and musical and artistic, okay? So this is the right side, right? So musical, visual, artistic, okay? The left side is the side that tends to be logical. So we have logic, math, and then even language, right? Maybe grammar, putting words together, right? That is said to be the left side of the brain. Okay, so when we look at each hemisphere, they are divided into lobes. And one of the really interesting things about these hemispheres is that we now know that people can actually be quite normal with only half a brain. Because there have actually been people born who during development only developed one side of their brain, and they seem to be pretty normal. They might have some learning disabilities, but they're relatively normal with just half the brain, right? So there's actually lots of plasticity in our brain, and so it's kind of interesting. Okay, so if we look at the lobes, there are 5 of these, and it's going to be very easy to remember these because these are named the same thing as the cranial skull bones. So for example, we have the frontal lobe. Right, so that generally is problem solving, right? So we have the frontal lobe. Sometimes they also talk about the prefrontal lobe. So that's at the very front of the frontal lobe, right? And it's kind of interesting because this is kind of is associated with long-term goals, for example. And so they have discovered that people that are teenagers, right, oftentimes it's impossible for them to think, well, I should do this now because this will benefit me in the future, because their prefrontal lobe has not developed. So teenagers tend to be a little bit less ability to plan, to make plans and to think ahead because of their, the prefrontal lobe doesn't actually finish developing until you're in your 20s.
Is that also associated with imagination, like when you're imagining something? You know, like if you're...
Yeah, I think well, it depends upon how you're imagining. If it's visual, then sometimes that's the visual part of your brain. If I'm imagining a scene, or if I'm imagining music, I think it's different, but I'm not sure. Okay, so we have the frontal, they're on each side. So then we have the parietal. What's on the side of the head? Ear. What's on the side with the ear? Temporal. Vision is associated with the back of your head, so that's called occipital. So sometimes you can hit the back of your head and damage that part, and that'll affect your ability to see or to make sense of what you're seeing. So there's 4 there, okay? So there's one that you actually have to remember, which is called the insula. Okay, so what do you think that word means? Insula. It's insulated, so it is actually inside. So you cannot see it from the surface of the brain, but there's actually part of the cortex has become buried inside, and it's on the lateral side. It has become buried, and that's the insula lobe. Okay. So let's see what we have up the diagram here and I show you, okay? So this just shows the 2 hemispheres, right? This is the frontal lobe. This is the longitudinal fissure connecting the 2 sides. And if you were to open this up just a little bit, you would be able to see the corpus callosum down in there. The parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, right? And you can also see that there's blood vessels that deliver blood to the brain. Okay. Oops. Yes.
Is it like the heart as for when you look at it, it's actually flipped? So there's like, if you look at the brain,
Okay, so this actually shows the insula. So notice that they've taken a little piece of this out, right? So this is a little piece, and then they kind of opened it up. Actually, maybe that is another picture of it. It's probably another picture that shows the insula lobe, but that's kind of where the insula lobe would be located in there, okay? And so here they have them color-coded. So the prefrontal cortex is just at the very front, right? This would be, frontal cortex is most of this, right? And then notice how I mentioned there's that central sulcus, and then the precentral, which means in front of the sulcus, and the postcentral, which means behind the sulcus. And those will be important when we talk about them, okay? And then notice the gray matter is on the outside, and then it has ridges and grooves, right? And so it increases the surface area. Okay, so one of the things about the cerebral cortex is it can be broken down into different areas. So if we look at the areas, we have sensory, we have motor, and then we have association. So when we look at the different parts of the cerebral cortex, you can talk about, for example, the olfactory cortex. And what is that? Smell, right? How about the gustatory? Taste, right? How about auditory? Hearing, right? Cortex. And then you have the visual cortex. Okay, so those are the primary senses. And this is important to realize that this is the only conscious part of your brain. So we can consciously perceive sensations of smell. So the olfactory, we'll talk about the olfactory bulb. It is not conscious, right? So this is the only part of the conscious brain. So actually sometimes we can sense smells and react to them without consciously perceiving them. So those would be examples of sensory. Now we have another part of the cortex which is also sensory, which is called somatosensory. So what does soma mean? Body, right? And so this would include touch. Okay. So on the surface of the skin, all over the body, the touch receptors go to the somatosensory cortex. It is actually on the post-central gyrus. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. We also have proprioception. So one of the cool things about our muscles is that we have sensory receptors in there that tell my body if a muscle is stretched. So I can tell if my pectoralis major, right, is stretching. And I can also tell the location of my joints. So I can tell when my arm is bent, for example, without actually having to look at it, because there are receptors inside the joint cavity that can tell me that information. So this has to do, proprioception has to do with muscle stretch and joint position. Or maybe not joint position, maybe bone position, but it's in the joints. Okay. We also have on the surface of the skin, we have thermoreceptors, which we looked at in lab. Right. And then we also have pain receptors, and pain receptors are called nociceptors. So these are pain. So if I get pricked or bitten by a bug, for example, then it would go to the somatosensory cortex, and I would be able to tell where the bug is, where I just been bitten, right? Because of that, of it going there and me being able to consciously perceive it. Okay. We also have a visceral cortex. So what do you think that gives us information at? Organs, right? Internal body, right? So organs. And we'll talk about why, for example, if your appendix hurts or if your liver hurts, why sometimes you feel it on the surface of the skin. So we'll talk about why it is. And the reason, I'll just give you a brief introduction to that, is that they run the same pathways. And so sometimes there is, like if I have pain on the surface of my skin, which is sometimes referred to as nerve pain, that can actually be associated with pain that is being stimulated in my organs. Right. So if my stomach hurts, sometimes that skin will hurt. Okay, so this would be sensory. We also have what is called the motor cortex. And this is on the precentral gyrus. Now, the motor cortex sends signals out to the body rather than signals being sent into the brain. It initiates the signals and sends them out to the muscles. So when we look at the way that this moves, we can refer to what are called corticospinal tracts. Corticospinal tracts. So remember that the brain has no nerves. They only have tracts in the brain. And so notice that this is going from the cortex, cortico, to the spinal, right? And then this is going to send a signal out to the muscles, the skeletal muscles in particular, to allow them to move, right? So it goes out to the skeletal muscles. Okay. And the types of neurons that innervate the skeletal muscles are also called motor neurons. And remember that they produce and release acetylcholine. Okay, so let's just look at a diagram that shows some of these ideas. Okay, so here is just a cross section, a coronal section of the brain, and you can see this would actually be the corpus callosum connecting the two. Most of this is white matter, except for these nuclei, which are little places in the white matter, little islands of gray matter. Okay, so this is a diagram that shows that specialization of the cortex. And so this is called the central gyrus. So this would be, excuse me, the sulcus. So this would be the precentral gyrus, which is motor. Okay. Here, this would be the somatosensory cortex right there. Okay. And then back here, we have the visual cortex. And one of the really interesting things about vision is that we can see stuff, but in order for us to make sense of it, we also have to have what is called the visual association area. And so there's actually a wonderful, I think he maybe died. I think he died recently, and his name was Oliver Sacks. Did he die? Does anybody know? Not Oliver's, but Oliver Sacks. He was a neurologist, but he also wrote these great books about neurology. Oops. Oliver Sacks. And he wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. So he got to do all these crazy, when people would have brain damage and he would get to study them, right? And so the idea here is that we could see images, or this man could see images, but he could make no association. Like he didn't understand what he was seeing. So it wasn't the visual cortex itself, the primary cortex, that was damaged. It was actually the association area that was damaged. And so some people have this problem where they can see a face, but they do not recognize it. So like there's people that have brain damage, and people in their family will come in and they won't be able to recognize them until they say something. So like they're not even able to recognize their own children. They can recognize them by their voices, but not by what they look at like. So they know that that's a face, but they have no ability to tell whose face it is. And so that would be the association area. Yes.
Is that, if that happens, is it anybody or just certain people that are like?
Everybody. Yeah, so everybody they're not able to recognize. And they can't learn to recognize them either because that part of their brain has become damaged. And so then we have different areas like gustatory is a little bit in front of the auditory, right? And then, let's see, where do they have the olfactory? I don't know if they have the olfactory on here. They don't, okay.
What is the word keys again?
You know, I think that has to do with language. I know Broca's area is also language, right? And then this is the prefrontal, the solving complex problems, making plans, that kind of stuff. Okay. So one of the interesting things, if we go back up here and we're looking at the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensories, is that these form homuncululi, okay, which means little person. So they have mapped the areas to specific regions of the brain. So for example, the somatosensory. So they do this by looking at brain activity when you touch a part of the body. And so the homunculi is a little man, a little person that looks something like this. Okay. So this person right here, right, has huge hands, right? Little tiny elbows, huge feet, right? And so what that tells us is that certain parts of the body are associated with larger regions of the cortex. So your hand, for example, is associated with a greater region, a greater amount of that cortex than, say, for example, your elbow. Now, it used to be when you would teach brain science, they used to say that once you became an adult, your brain lost the ability to change. And so this was like the central dogma of brain anatomy. But recently they discovered that that is not necessarily the case. And so now they think that your brain can adjust. So let's say, for example, if you lose part of your body, so let's say if you lose your hand and you start using your feet, you lose both hands, you start using your feet for stuff, then the feet are going to start to take over more parts of that cerebral cortex. So the more you use your toes or walk around barefoot or use your toes for any function and pay attention to them, the more of that cortex is going to be associated with your toes. Okay. So this actually kind of also relates to phantom limb. So we just talked about plasticity. So there's plasticity, which is the ability to change. Okay, so there's plasticity in the brain. But then we also have the problem which is called phantom limb syndrome. Right? And so this is only a problem if my phantom limb is in pain. Like I imagine it's not that big of a problem if I lose an arm, but I sense that it is still there. So the reason why that is that part of the cortex that is still associated with that arm is still there, right? So if I lose one of my arms, my cortex still thinks I have an arm, right? But it's a big problem if the arm is in pain. So let's say that I feel my phantom limb and it feels like it's on fire, for example. Then my brain is going to tell me that I have this arm that's on fire and it's going to be extremely painful. Or if it feels like I'm clenching the muscles and I have a muscle cramp in my phantom limb. So one of the interesting things about this is that they've actually found that you can retrain a person if they are sensing pain in their phantom limb. You can use mirrors to trick the brain. And this is just like this phenomenal thing because it's so cheap to set up. Like it doesn't take a lot, right? So like if I feel like I'm clenching this hand, but it's not there, right? So what I do is I put myself with a box and a mirror's in the middle, and I put one arm in it, and it looks like my other arm is here, but it's not, right? So it looks like I have two arms. And so what then I do is I unclench this arm, and it looks like I'm unclenching my phantom limb, right? Or I can see that my phantom limb is not on fire, right? And then the brain's like, oh, okay, everything's fine, and you stop sensing it, right? So it's quite amazing the way that the brain changes and how it is able to allow you to sense the different parts of your body, but also how it can change if something changes in your activity or in losing a body part. Okay. Are there any questions about that?
I watched a TV show once where they did an experiment like that, where they had somebody, like, they faked out that their arm was on the table, and then they hit the fake arm, and they'd still feel pain.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay. Now, there is another interesting thing that is related. And so just notice that this is the motor, right? And this is the somatosensory. So both of those little people, the homunculi, are associated with both. And so notice that in the face where we have these fine motor skills, so we're having to send out action potentials to the face, that takes up a greater part of the cerebral cortex. Okay. There is another interesting idea that is related to brain plasticity, and this is called synesthesia. Does anybody know what synesthesia means in this context? Yeah. Sometimes this is referred to as sensory mixing. Okay. Sensory mixing. Okay, so synesthesia has been associated with people that are make really incredible breakthroughs in their field of interest. Because let's say that you look at a number, so this is just an example, look at a number and you see a color, right? So like red is always associated with number 5, or green is always associated with number blue, right? So those are kind of the same, that's visual. But what if you look at a number and you hear a sound? Right, so if you're a mathematician and you look at a number and it makes a particular sound, right, and then the numbers together kind of harmonize, right? Sometimes that can really be an important in terms of their field of study, because it allows them to see and to interpret things differently than what would normally be done. And so synesthesia is geniuses. But also sometimes this happens in people that have autism. So autism can be one of the symptoms of autism, which is kind of a broad spectrum now. We realize that it's not under one, there's not just one type of autism, there's many types of autism. But one of the interesting things is that sometimes they do have sensory mixing, right? So a bright light, for example, could be like a really high-pitched sound. And so when they come into a bright lit room, they might hear just a sound that is just so excruciating, which makes them freak out, right, and act really weird. Right? And we're like, what's wrong with them, And we don't even realize that they're hearing a sound because of the bright light. Yeah.
Is that like why all little kids' toys, whenever you click on a number or letter or something, it has like a noise to happening with it, or?
Oh, interesting. No, I think that that's association. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see if like 5 is usually red or blue or green or yellow.
Specific colors for each of them.
Oh, interesting. Yep. Yep. Okay. So we talked about the cerebral white area, right? And we mentioned that we have commissural fibers, corpus callosum being important, right? We also have tracts. So those cortical spinal tracts. Okay. We also have association fibers. And the association fibers go from one part of the cortex to another. So they connect one part of the cortex to another. And this might be, this is the basis for association areas, but it could also be the basis for synesthesia if they somehow get connected by the association fibers. So if we look at an example of this, okay. So just paying attention to the lines and noticing the lines are in the white area, right? So this is my commissural fibers. This is my corpus callosum. This is called the corticospinal tract. There's another word for it. It's called pyramidal. And those are projection. We'll write that down in a minute. Those are the projection fibers. And then notice how from one part of the cortex to another, that's the association. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to put projection, commissural, projection, and association. Okay, so this is, I just forgot to mention that is projection fibers. Okay. So the other important thing to realize with the brain is that one part of the brain coordinates the sensory and the motor of the opposite side of the body. So we have one hemisphere is associated with the opposite side of the body. It can cross over. This crossing over could take place in the brain, but it could also take place in the spinal cord. So crossing over. Okay. So if you touch my right foot, it's going to send an action potential up my spinal cord, and then it's going to cross over. It probably crosses over before my brain. Cross over, and then it's going to light up the left side of my brain, right? So my left side of my brain is associated with the right side of my body. So this is particularly important when we talk about strokes, right? So let's say we have a stroke, which we talked about. This could be a broken blood vessel or a blocked blood vessel to part of the brain, right? So if I have a stroke and I have damage in my left hemisphere, it's going to affect movement in my right side of my body, right? So opposite damage affects opposite side of the body. Did you have a question?
I said that's called Bell's palsy.
No.
When half of the face is stripped.
Yes, but it's not. Bell's palsy is not a stroke. We'll talk about that. No. Yeah, it's
That's what I learned in medical school.
okay.
My dad had a stroke.
Bell's palsy, we're talking about, that's the facial nerve, and it can be due to a virus. And generally people recover from that. Most of their function of their face recovers over a little period of time when the nerve is able to repair itself. Yes. Okay. So the other part of the cerebral hemispheres, we have white matter, but then we also have this matter that would be gray matter embedded in the white matter, and those are called ganglia. And so the basal nuclei are gray matter, and these are ganglia. Not ganglia, sorry, nuclei. Oh, nuclei. Okay, so one of the functions of the basal nuclei is it allows for smooth motor function. So if you have damage to the basal nuclei, sometimes your movements are jerky, right? So the basal nuclei seem to smooth out the fine motor skills so that you can perform precise, elegant movements rather than jerky movements. And then it also seems to be related to regulating attention and cognition. I'm just taking this from your book, but regulating attention and cognition. And I think that what this refers to is that action potentials, if you look at the activity of your cerebral cortex has to always be active. If it stops and there's no electricity in your cerebral cortex, then you are brain dead. And so this actually helps to keep those signals being sent to the cortex so that you stay alert, right? So it helps to kind of keep the electricity continually being sent to the cortex. Okay, so if we look at a picture of the basal nuclei, there's other types of nucleuses in here, right? And do we have a picture of the basal nuclei? Oh, I'm not sure where it is in here. I don't think that's the image. Oops. Oh, here they are. So this shows the basal nuclei. They're not pink, but they would be gray matter. So right here and right here. Okay, so that's the telencephalon. And part of the telencephalon, or part of the forebrain, is referred to as the diencephalon. So the forebrain, the prosencephalon, consists of not only the telencephalon, but also the diencephalon. So we're going to write down here the diencephalon. This is part of the prosencephalon. Okay. So the diencephalon consists of the thalamus. And the thalamus is the relay station for all sensory information coming into the brain. So this could be smell, it could be images, it could be touch. Everything has to go through the thalamus. So this is the largest part of the diencephalon. Right, so the largest part. So that's the central area. Now, also associated with the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. So this is underneath the thalamus. And the hypothalamus is associated with appetite. So like when you're really hungry, the hormone ghrelin will make you feel like you have to eat, right? And that is actually affecting the hypothalamus. So it's sending signals out saying that you are hungry. Okay. The same thing for thirst. So when you feel thirsty, it's because the hypothalamus is sending signals out to the conscious part of the brain saying you need to drink in order to decrease your solute concentrations in your blood. And then this is thermoregulation. So if you get too cold, you will start to shiver. If you get too hot, you start to sweat. And then interestingly with these, we also have sexual arousal. Right? So for example, having an erection, if the erectile tissue in either the male or the female, the clitoris or the penis becomes engorged, then that's kind of the sexual arousal kind of feeling. And that is also regulated by the hypothalamus. Okay. Then we have what is called the epithalamus. This has another name. This is called the pineal gland. And what substance does the pineal gland produce that you could actually go to a pharmacy in town and buy to supplement? So you could actually take it as a pill. Does anybody know? Melatonin, right? So this produces melatonin, which is associated with circadian rhythms. That's a C, not an E. So this is circa. Circa means around the day, right? So this is sleep-wake cycles. So I got sleep-wake cycles. So the interesting thing about the pineal gland is it releases melatonin at night. So melatonin is released at night. And so they've done research, and if you're using a device like an iPad in your bed or your phone, that actually inhibits the release of melatonin. So if you're up all night and you have insomnia and you're trying to sleep, using a device is like a bad thing to do because that's going to decrease your melatonin, right? And then people that need to work at night and sleep during the day have to cut out all light, right? So that melatonin will be released and sleep can ensue. So the crazy thing about the pineal gland is that in us, it is buried in our brain, right? So it is very strange that something that is reacting to light is buried in our brain. But if we look at some more primitive or maybe more ancestral organisms, like reptiles, right? They have a third eye, right? And what this is a transparent scale that transmits light into the pineal gland. Right. So in Hinduism, right, the third eye is like right here in the middle of your forehead between your two brows, right? So people oftentimes will put something there, right? And then if you're going to go all the way back into the center of your brain, from that would actually be about where your pituitary and also kind of where your pineal gland is located. And so this is interesting because this tells us that the mechanism has to be different in us than it is in reptiles because we do not have a light getting transmitted into the center of our brain. So if we look at where our pineal gland is located in our bodies, right, it is located right here. Right? So that's the pineal gland. The pineal gland is also referred to as the epithalamus. So you want to write that down. Epithalamus, which means it's upon the thalamus. Okay. So if we look at where these are located, this is the pineal gland or the epithalamus. This would be my thalamus right here, and this is my hypothalamus. So what is thought to do is that we actually get action potentials sent from our eyes, have to go to the pineal gland to signal when it should release melatonin and when it should not. So it's kind of interesting because some people with blindness, if they have damage to their optic nerve, which is causing the blindness, then they will also have difficulty regulating their circadian rhythms. But if they're blind for some other reason, rather maybe damage to their retina, and they can still get action potentials being sent to the pineal gland, then they can regulate their sleep-wake cycle. So you can imagine if you're blind and you can't see anything, what tells you when to get up and what tells you when to be sleepy. And so sometimes if you're blind, sometimes it can be a big problem because maybe you want to be awake in the middle of the night and asleep during the day because you're not getting the right signals to your pineal gland. Okay. So melatonin is an interesting, they call it a candidate hormone, because it might also have other effects in the body. And so there's been a lot of controversy over whether or not it should be sold over the counter, because we don't really know what other things melatonin do. And this is really kind of interesting because melatonin in insects actually regulates metamorphosis. So it's actually called juvenile hormone. So when an insect goes from a caterpillar to a butterfly, it is actually melatonin that signals that transformation. And so melatonin might be doing more than just telling us to get sleepy. So some people argue that you probably should be really careful when you take it because you don't know what other things it might be doing to your body. Okay, so we'll stop there for today and we'll continue with talking about the central nervous system on Wednesday.